The beeping was the only sound I remember. Not my name being called, not footsteps rushing toward me. Just that steady, mechanical beeping and then nothing. I had been standing in the church hall, helping set up for the Thursday morning prayer group the way I had every week for 11 years. I remember picking up a folding chair, and then I remember the ceiling. That's it. One moment, I was standing, and the next I was looking up at the water-stained tiles above St. Andrew's and wondering why everything felt so far away. When I opened my eyes in the hospital, the first thing I saw was a nurse I didn't know adjusting something on a monitor beside my bed. She had kind eyes and she squeezed my hand when she noticed I was awake. She told me I was at St. 21. Michael's. She told me I'd had a cardiac event. She told me I was stable. She didn't tell me that my son had not come. I found that out on my own. Slowly. The way you find out things you already knew, but weren't ready to say out loud. I'm 64 years old. I was born in Sudbury, Ontario, and I have lived in this country my entire life. I raised my children here, my son, whom I'll call Derek, and my daughter, whom I'll call Melissa. I worked for 31 years as an administrative coordinator for a school board in the Ottawa Valley. I am not a dramatic person. I am not someone who exaggerates. I want you to understand that before I tell you the rest, Derek is 39. He lives about 2 hours away, just outside of Toronto. We had not spoken much in the past year, not because of any one thing, but because of many small things that had accumulated the way snow accumulates. You don't notice it happening, and then one morning you open the door and you can't get out. Melissa lives closer to me. About 40 minutes away in a smaller town just past the turnoff for the highway. She had been the one I called when my husband passed 4 years ago. She had been the one who sat with me at the kitchen table while the funeral home paperwork was sorted. When I think of the person who showed up for me, I think of her first. But I'm getting ahead of myself. The nurse, her name was Patricia. I learned later told me on my second morning in the hospital that the paramedics had found my emergency contact card in my wallet. My son's name and number were listed first because I had made the card years ago and he had been living closer at the time. Patricia told me, gently, the way people tell you things they know will hurt, that they had called that number many times before I was admitted and several more times after. I asked her how many times. She paused. She looked at the chart. She said they had logged 31 attempts over the first 18 hours. 31. I lay there and I counted the ceiling tiles. I got to 22 and lost track and started again. She also told me that someone had eventually picked up not Derek, but a woman whose voice she described as sounding annoyed and rushed. This woman had said Derek was unavailable and that she would pass along the message. Patricia had explained it was a medical emergency. The woman had said she understood and had ended the call. No one came. I was in St. Michael's for 4 days. In those 4 days, Derek did not call the hospital. He did not call my cell phone, which Melissa had brought me on the first afternoon along with my glasses and a change of clothes and a container of the lentil soup she had made the night before because she said she had a feeling I might want something from home. He did not send a message through anyone. What he did do, I found out later, was post 3 times on his social media. I know this because my neighbor's daughter follows him and she showed her mother, and her mother, bless her heart, did not know what to do with that information, and eventually told me herself because she thought I deserved to know. The first post was a photo of a fire pit somewhere up north, captioned something about disconnecting and finding peace. The second was a video of him laughing at dinner with a group of people I didn't recognize. The third was a long written post about protecting your energy and choosing joy and setting boundaries with people who drain you. It had been posted on the second day I was in the hospital. I read it sitting up in my hospital bed with Melissa beside me, and I felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with my heart condition. It was quieter than anger. It was the feeling of understanding something you had been trying not to understand for a very long time. I want to tell you about Melissa, because she matters to this story more than she probably knows. Melissa is 36. She works as a dental hygienist, and she has 2 kids in elementary school and a husband who coaches their son's hockey team on weekends. She is busy in the way that most people her age are busy constantly, in every direction, with very little left over at the end of the day. And still, when the hospital called her, because she was my second emergency contact, she had been in the middle of a parent-teacher interview. She had excused herself, stepped into the hallway, and asked the nurse to repeat everything slowly so she could write it down. She had called her husband, picked up her kids early, dropped them with her neighbor, and been at my bedside within 2 hours. She stayed until 9 o'clock that first night. She came back the next morning before her shift. She coordinated with my cardiologist to understand my discharge instructions. She called my family doctor herself because she wasn't sure I was well enough to navigate the referral system alone. She did all of this without being asked. Now let me tell you about the money, because it becomes important. When my husband Harold passed 4 years ago, we had a modest estate, not wealthy by any measure, but comfortable. We had paid off our house in the Ottawa Valley. We had some savings, and Harold had a small pension. When I sold the house 2 years ago and moved into a bungalow closer to Melissa, I came away with about $140. 000. After everything was settled, I put it in a registered account. I updated my will. I had a lawyer in town, a woman named Deborah, draw up the documents properly, the way Harold had always said we should. I split things evenly between my 2 children. That was the will as it stood when I arrived at St. Michael's. On the 3rd day of my hospital stay, Deborah called me. I was surprised to hear from her. We weren't in the habit of speaking socially, only professionally, and I hadn't contacted her recently. She asked how I was doing, and I told her I'd had a bit of a health scare, trying to keep my voice light. And she went quiet in a way that told me she already knew. She told me that she had received a call 2 days prior from someone identifying himself as Derek. He had asked questions about the process for updating a will. He had specifically asked what would happen if one beneficiary were to be deemed more capable of managing an estate. He had asked whether a family member could petition for power of attorney if they believed the primary holder was becoming mentally unfit. Deborah told me she had not provided him with any information beyond general public knowledge, because he was not her client, and she had no authorization to discuss my file. But she told me she felt I should know the call had been made. I held the phone for a long time after she hung up. I thought about Harold. I thought about the night we sat at our kitchen table in Sudbury and talked about what we wanted our lives to look like when we were old. We had agreed on the same things: to be near family, to be useful, to not be a burden, to leave something behind for the people who loved us. We had not imagined this. Melissa came by that afternoon, and I told her what Deborah had said. She sat very still while I spoke. When I finished, she didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, quietly, that she thought I should call Deborah back and ask about my options. That is Melissa. She doesn't raise her voice. She just points toward the door you need to walk through. Derek called on the 5th day. I was home by then. Settled on my couch with a cup of tea and the home care schedule Melissa had helped me put together. My phone rang and his name appeared on the screen, and I sat and looked at it for several seconds before answering. He did not ask how I was feeling. He said hello. And then he said he'd heard I'd been in the hospital. And then he said he hoped I was okay. All in the tone of someone reading from a list. Then he paused and asked if I had spoken to my lawyer recently. I said I had. He paused again. He said he had just been thinking about some things. He said he thought we should sit down and have a conversation about planning for the future and making sure everyone was on the same page. I asked him what page he thought we were on. He said he just wanted to make sure things were organized. He said it in a careful voice, the voice of someone who has rehearsed. I told him I appreciated his concern and that I would be in touch. I hung up and called Deborah. I want to be fair. I don't know everything that was in my son's mind during those days. I don't know if he genuinely convinced himself he was protecting me or planning ahead, or whether he ever once thought about what it meant that his mother had been hospitalized and he had spent those days up north posting about choosing joy. People tell themselves stories to justify what they do. I have done it myself. But I also know what he did not do. He did not come. Deborah and I met the following week. I told her everything, the 31 calls, the 4 days, the social media posts, the questions he had asked her office. She listened without interrupting. When I finished, she asked me what I wanted to do. I told her I wanted to change my will. It took about an hour. In the new version, I left Derek a sum of $1, what Deborah called a nominal bequest, used to indicate that the omission was intentional and not an oversight. The remainder of my estate, including the $140,000, still sitting in my registered account, I left to Melissa. I also signed a new power of attorney designating Melissa as my decision maker in any medical or financial emergency. I named a second person as well, my neighbor's daughter, the one whose mother had told me about the social media posts. She had come by to check on me twice since I'd gotten home. She had brought groceries the second time without being asked. That is the thing about people who genuinely care about you. They don't announce it. They just show up. I did not tell Derek about the will. I did not tell him about the power of attorney. He called again 2 weeks later and I let him speak, and I was polite and I gave him very little to hold on to. At the end of the call, he mentioned again that we should sit down soon and talk about the future. I said I thought that was a good idea. I have not yet arranged that meeting. I may not. What I did arrange, about 6 weeks after I got out of the hospital, was a trip. Melissa and I and her 2 kids drove out to Prince Edward Island for a long weekend in October. We stayed in a little inn near Cavendish, the kind of place with quilts on the beds and no television in the room. And we walked on the red sand beaches in the mornings while the kids ran ahead of us picking up shells. Melissa drank tea and I drank decaf because my cardiologist had suggested I reduce my caffeine. And we talked about Harold and about her kids and about nothing in particular. And it was the best 4 days I had spent in a long time. On the second morning, standing at the edge of the water while the tide came in around our boots, Melissa said something I have thought about many times since. She said she was sorry I had been alone in that hospital. She said she wished she had been listed first. I told her she had arrived in 2 hours and stayed until 9 o'clock and brought me lentil soup and coordinated with my cardiologist and made a home care schedule. I told her she could not have done more. She didn't say anything. She just took my arm. I have been home for 4 months now. I go to cardiac rehab on Tuesday and Thursday mornings at the community center. I have a good cardiologist and a good family doctor, and Melissa calls me every few days and drops by on Sundays. My neighbor's daughter has my spare key. I think about what those 18 hours meant, the 31 calls, the unanswered phone, the fire pit posts, the questions to my lawyer. I think about Harold and what he would say. He was a quiet man, not given to pronouncements. But I think I know. He would say that you learn who people are not in the ordinary moments but in the ones that cost something. Anyone can be kind when it's easy. The question is, who shows up when it isn't? My daughter showed up. I kept my $140. Ling, ling, ling. And I have finally stopped waiting for an apology that was never going to come. Not because I've stopped hurting, I have not, but because I have decided that my time and my energy belong to the people who have earned them. Melissa has earned them. My neighbor's daughter has earned them. The women in my cardiac rehab group, who share their muffins and their stories on Thursday mornings, have earned them. That is enough. It is more than enough. If you are listening to this, and you recognize yourself somewhere in this story, either as the person who was not called back, or as the person who didn't call, I hope it gives you something. I hope it gives you the courage to look honestly at the relationships in your life and ask who is actually there. Not who says they will be there. Not who shows up when it's convenient. Who is actually consistently, quietly there. For me, it turns out, the answer was simpler than I expected. It was the person who brought the soup. I had a stroke in my own kitchen on a Tuesday morning in February, and my son didn't find out for 4 days. Not because no one tried to reach him. The paramedics tried. The hospital tried. My neighbor Elaine tried, standing in her housecoat at 7 in the morning, dialing his number over and over from the hallway outside my apartment while they loaded me onto the stretcher. 31 calls between the hospital and Elaine over 4 days. 31. Not one answered. When he finally called back, his voice was warm and relaxed in a way that told me everything before he said a word. "Mom, hey, just saw a bunch of missed calls. What's going on?" He sounded like a man who'd just woken up from a very good nap, and I was lying in a hospital bed in Thunder Bay with a compression stocking on my left leg and a physiotherapist's appointment booked for the next morning. That was the moment I understood, not the moment he didn't answer, not even the moment I woke up and saw that the only person in the room was Elaine, 74 years old and still in her coat because she hadn't gone home. No. The moment I understood was when I heard his voice, and it was fine. Completely fine, and I realized he hadn't been desperate to reach me. He'd called back when it was convenient. But I'm getting ahead of myself. My name is Joyce, and I'm 64 years old. I've lived in Thunder Bay, Ontario for most of my adult life. I worked for 31 years as a registered nurse at the regional hospital, which is both ironic and fitting, depending on how you look at it. My husband, Terrence, died 3 years ago from pancreatic cancer, which is the kind of illness that moves like a freight train. 14 weeks from diagnosis to the end, I held his hand for the last one. My son is 38. He lives in Vaughan, just north of Toronto, with his wife and my 2 grandchildren, a boy named Callum, who's 9, and a girl named Wren, who's 6. I last saw them at Thanksgiving. That was 4 months before the stroke. My daughter-in-law is polite to me in the way that people are polite to someone they're tolerating. Her mother visits every second week. I've been there twice since Callum was born. I'm not telling you this to make you feel sorry for me. I'm telling you so you understand that what happened wasn't a surprise. Not really. It was the conclusion of a sentence that had been building for 3 years. The morning it happened, I was making oatmeal. That's the part that stays with me. Not dramatic, not meaningful. I was making oatmeal with brown sugar and a sliced banana. The same breakfast I've had every Tuesday for probably 20 years. And then the left side of my face went numb and the spoon hit the floor and I grabbed the counter and thought, no, not like this. I made it to the phone. I'd like to think that's because of the nursing instinct, the part of my brain that stays clinical even when the rest of it is terrified. I dialed 911. I sat down on the kitchen floor because I didn't trust my legs. I unlocked the front door because I knew the paramedics would need to get in. These are the things they train you for, and the things that saved me, probably. Elaine heard the ambulance. She came down the hall in her housecoat and slippers and grabbed my hand in the elevator on the way down. She didn't let go until they wouldn't let her come any further. Elaine is not related to me. She moved in down the hall 7 years ago after her husband passed. We started having coffee on Wednesday mornings because we were both alone and the building was quiet. That's the whole story. No history, no obligation, no blood. Just 2 women who made coffee at the same time and eventually became something more important than neighbors. She was the one who called my son. She had his number because I'd given it to her years ago, back when I still thought he'd want to be called in an emergency. She called him at 7:14 in the morning, then again at 9, then at 11 when the doctor confirmed the stroke, then again that afternoon when they moved me out of emergency and into a ward bed. She called him the next day. She called him the day after that. The hospital called him twice from the nurse's station, left voicemails with my room number and the ward phone. On day 4, he called back. I thought a lot about where he was and what he was doing. He told me later, much later, that they'd been in Cabo San Lucas for their anniversary. He and his wife had left Calaman with her parents and flown to Mexico on the Friday before my stroke. They came back the following Thursday. He said his phone had had trouble with international service. He said the resort Wi-Fi was unreliable. I know this isn't true because he texted his wife's sister photos from the beach on the Sunday. I know this because his wife's sister, who is a decent person, came to see me in the hospital and let it slip without realizing what she was saying. Beautiful pictures, she said. That resort looked absolutely stunning. So he had service, he had Wi-Fi, he had a phone that worked perfectly well. He just didn't answer. The doctors told me I was lucky. Ischemic stroke, caught early enough because I'd had the presence of mind to call 911 and unlock my door. No permanent paralysis. Some weakness in my left hand that they expected would improve with physio. Fatigue that would last months. I'd need medication for the rest of my life. Monitoring, follow-up appointments, lifestyle changes. I was 64 years old. I'd just spent 31 years taking care of other people in hospital beds. And now I was in one myself, and the only person who'd sat with me for 4 days was Elaine. When my son finally called back and I told him what had happened, there was a long pause. Then he said, "Mom, oh my God, why didn't you call me?" I said, "I didn't call you. The hospital called you. Elaine called you. You were called 31 times. Another pause. "Mom, the service was really bad down there. I barely had any signal." I said, "I know." He said, "I'm coming up this weekend. I'll bring the kids." I said, "Okay." I should have said more. I know that now, but I was 4 days post-stroke and I was tired in a way that went all the way through me, and I just didn't have the words yet for what I knew. He came that Saturday. He and his wife drove up with the kids, arrived around noon, stayed until 4, 3.5 hours. Callum brought me a drawing he'd made at school, a house with a big yellow sun and "Get well, Grandma" written across the top in red crayon. I put it on the windowsill immediately. His wife asked the nurses 3 questions about my prognosis, none of which were about my quality of life. My son sat in the chair beside my bed and told me about the resort, the food, the swim-up bar, the sunset they'd watched from their private balcony. He mentioned the vacation 4 times in 3.5 hours. He asked about my medication once. When they left, my daughter-in-law hugged me with the careful precision of someone who has been told they need to make more of an effort. My son squeezed my shoulder. "We'll come back soon," he said. "We'll figure out a plan." I watched them walk down the hall and I thought, they came to see whether the situation required anything from them. They decided it didn't. Elaine came that evening with a container of soup she'd made from scratch, a beef barley that Terrence used to love, because she'd asked me once what his favorite was, and she remembered. She sat with me for 2 hours. She didn't talk about the resort. I was discharged 10 days after the stroke. My son had offered to drive up and bring me home. I told him Elaine had it covered, which was true, and he sounded relieved in a way he probably didn't realize was audible. The apartment felt strange when I got back, smaller somehow and very quiet. Elaine had watered my plants while I was gone and left a casserole in the fridge with a sticky note that said, "Reheat 350, 25 min, don't forget the foil." I sat in the kitchen and looked at the spoon I'd dropped on the floor and thought about how different everything was now, even though nothing had changed. Over the next few weeks, as I started physiotherapy and tried to build some routine back into my days, I kept coming back to something I couldn't quite name, a feeling like the edges of things had gone clear in a way they hadn't been before. I started to pay attention differently. My son called every Sunday evening. These calls lasted between 8 and 14 minutes. I know because I started timing them. Not out of resentment, just I wanted to understand. He'd ask how I was feeling. I'd tell him. He'd give me an update on the kids and his work, and then he'd find a natural stopping point and wrap it up. They were pleasant calls. They were the calls you make to someone you feel obligated to call. One evening in March, about 6 weeks after the stroke, a woman from my church named Roberta stopped by with a lemon loaf. We'd known each other for years. She'd sung in the choir with Terrence. She sat at my kitchen table, and we talked for a while, and then she got a little quiet in the way people do when they're working up to something. She said, "Joyce, I want to ask you something, and I hope you'll tell me if it's out of line." I said, "Go ahead." She said, "Your son called me in January, before you had the stroke." I put my tea down. She said, "He called me out of the blue. I hadn't spoken to him in, years probably. He was asking about you, how you seemed, mentally, whether you'd seemed confused or forgetful, whether I'd noticed any changes." I said, "What did you tell him?" She said, "I told him you were sharp as a tack and he had nothing to worry about, but he kept pushing. He asked if you'd had any falls, any trouble managing on your own, whether I thought you were safe living alone, and then he asked me not to say anything to you about the call. Said he didn't want to worry you." She was watching me carefully. I told him I thought you were completely fine, but it stuck with me, Joyce. It stuck with me. I thanked her and didn't say much. After she left, I sat very still for a long time. The next week, I ran into a woman from my building named Patricia. She lived on the 3rd floor, and we'd chat in the laundry room sometimes. She asked how I was recovering, and somewhere in the conversation she mentioned, almost in passing, that my son had called her too. In January, same questions. How was I managing? Had she noticed anything off? Did I seem confused, forgetful, like maybe living alone wasn't safe for me anymore? 2 calls, same month, same questions. I thought about my apartment. I'd lived here for 6 years, since Terrence and I sold the house on Cumberland Street after he got sick. The apartment was mine. I owned it, not rented. I paid for it with the proceeds from the house sale. It was worth, at the time I bought it, around $320,000. In the current market, it was worth considerably more. I thought about my RRSP, my pension from 31 years of nursing, the survivor benefits from Terrence's life insurance. I was not a wealthy woman, but I was comfortable. I had assets, and the only person who knew the full shape of those assets, because I'd sat down with him after Terrence died and explained everything so someone else would know, was my son. I called Elaine. She came over in 10 minutes with 2 cups of coffee she'd made in her own kitchen and carried down the hall. I told her about Roberta, about Patricia, about the calls in January, 6 weeks before my stroke. Elaine is not a dramatic person. She listened to the whole thing without interrupting. When I finished, she set her cup down and said, "Joyce, he was building a case." I said, "That's what it feels like?" She said, "A case for what?" And I said, "I think I need to find out." It was Elaine who suggested I call my lawyer. I'd used the same family law firm in Thunder Bay for years. A woman named Miss Hartfield who'd helped me with Terrence's estate and the apartment purchase. I called her office the next morning. When I explained the situation, the calls to my neighbors, the questions about my mental competence, the stroke, the 31 unanswered calls, the resort vacation, there was a pause on her end. Then she said, "Joyce, I want you to come in." In Miss Hartfield's office, she laid out for me, calmly and without judgment, what she'd seen before in situations like this. Adult children sometimes began building a record of a parent's supposed decline before initiating a legal process to gain power of attorney or to challenge their capacity to manage their own affairs. The goal was usually financial. In Ontario, if a person was deemed mentally incapable, control of their assets could pass to a substitute decision-maker, often the next of kin who'd been making the calls, asking the questions, planting the seeds. She asked me if my son's name was on any of my accounts. I said no, not since I'd updated everything after Terrence died. She asked if I'd ever signed a power of attorney in his favor. I said I'd signed one years ago before Terrence got sick. She went quiet for a moment. Then she said, "Joyce, I'd like to revise that document immediately, and I'd also recommend we update your will." I want to be clear about something. Sitting in that chair, listening to Ms. Hartfield explain what my son may have been planning, I didn't feel rage. I'd expected to. Instead, I felt something quieter and much colder. Like the floor had shifted 2 inches to the left, and I was recalibrating my balance. The man who'd made those calls, who'd built that quiet case while I was making oatmeal and going to physio and missing his children. I'd raised him. I'd driven him to hockey practice at 5:30 in the morning for 6 years. I'd held his hand in the emergency room when he broke his collarbone at 11. I'd sat at his kitchen table the night before his wedding and told him how proud his father was. And he'd been on the phone with my neighbors in January asking if I seemed confused. Ms. Hartfield asked if I was certain about what I wanted to do. I said, I have never been more certain of anything. We met twice more over the following 2 weeks. She prepared a new will, a revoked power of attorney, and a trust for Callum and Wren, their education funds, protected with Ms. Hartfield as trustee, inaccessible to either of their parents until the kids turned 19. I left a significant portion of my estate to the nursing scholarship fund at the regional hospital, something Terrence and I had talked about doing for years. I left money to the church community fund. I left Aline enough to cover 2 years of her condo fees because she had earned it 10 times over by sitting in a hospital chair for 4 nights. My son received nothing in the revised will, nothing except a letter written by me explaining why. He didn't know any of this was coming. He called on a Sunday in April, cheerful, loose, same 14-minute rhythm. He mentioned that he and his wife had been talking, said they were a little worried about me managing on my own in Thunder Bay, said maybe it was worth looking at some options. Options was the word he used, like moving closer to them in Vaughan. Or, he added carefully, there were some really nice retirement communities in the area that offered support services for people with, he paused, medical histories like mine. I said, that's interesting. Why don't you come up next weekend and we can talk about it? He said, absolutely. We'll make a day of it. He arrived on a Saturday morning with his wife, without the kids. That told me something. They came in and sat in my living room, and they had the careful energy of people who had rehearsed. He was wearing a good jacket. She brought flowers. We sat down and I offered tea, and there were 20 minutes of polite conversation. And then my son cleared his throat and said, Mom, we've been doing some thinking about the future, about your situation. I said, I've been doing some thinking too. He said after the stroke, we're just worried. You're alone up here. You don't have family nearby. We think it might be time to consider. I said, before we go further, I want to show you something. I took the folder from the side table. Ms. Hartfield had made copies of everything, and I set it between us. I said, I know about the calls you made in January. To Roberta, to Patricia. I know you were asking them whether I seemed confused, whether I was safe alone, whether there was cause for concern about my mental competence. His wife's face went very still. I said, I had a stroke 6 weeks after those calls. The hospital called you 31 times over 4 days. You were in Cabo San Lucas and you had service because you sent photos to your sister-in-law on the Sunday. You didn't answer. He started to say something about the service, the Wi-Fi, the time difference. I said, you came to see me in hospital and stayed 3.5 hours. You mentioned the resort 4 times. You asked about my medication once. And 3 weeks later, you called me to suggest retirement communities. I let that sit. I said, I am 64 years old. I passed a full cognitive assessment 2 weeks after my stroke. My neurologist has documented my capacity in writing. I'm going to physio twice a week and I'm recovering well. I am not confused, I am not declining, and I am not moving to a retirement community in Vaughan. My daughter-in-law said, Joyce, that's not what I said, I revised my will last week. I've also revoked the power of attorney I signed years ago. Ms. Hartfield has prepared new documents. If you'd like to contact her office, I've put her number in this folder. My son's face had gone through several colors during this conversation. He landed on something that looked like controlled anger. He said, "Mom, you're overreacting. We were concerned about you. That's all. We're your family." I said, "You're right. You are my family." I let a moment pass. Then I said, "You know what I thought about when I woke up in that hospital bed?" I thought about the 31 calls. And then I thought about the calls you made in January. And I understood that I'd spent 3 years telling myself you were just busy, that Toronto is a long drive, that the kids have activities and you have work and nobody has enough time for everything. I made excuses for you the way I used to make excuses for difficult patients, because I believed the person I thought I knew was still in there somewhere, just overwhelmed. He said, "Mom bid." I said, "I'm not finished." The room went quiet. I said, "Your father died and you stayed 5 days. I handled the estate alone. I'd sent Callum birthday cards for 9 years and received a thank you call twice. I invited myself to your home last Christmas and your wife told me you were going to her parents' cabin in Muskoka. I found out about it because Callum mentioned it on a video call 3 days before you left. You hadn't told me." My daughter-in-law looked at the flowers she brought. They were sitting on the coffee table between us, yellow tulips in cellophane, still not in water. I said, "I became the obligation, and then I became the problem, and then I became the asset that needed to be managed." My son said, "We never thought of you as..." I said, "You called my neighbors to build a case for my incompetence before I had a stroke. I know what that means." He stood up. He said this was unfair, that I was punishing them for one missed emergency, that I was throwing away their relationship over a vacation. I said, "A vacation? You were on a resort vacation posting beach photos while the hospital left voicemails with my room number. That's what you're calling one missed emergency." He said, if you talk to a lawyer about contesting." I said, "Miss Hartfield has already told me what that would cost you and what the odds are. Please remember I worked in healthcare for 31 years and I know exactly what a documented cognitive assessment is worth in front of a court." His wife touched his arm. He looked at her. Something passed between them. They left 20 minutes later. At the door, he turned back. He said, "You're going to regret this when you actually need help someday." I said, "I needed help in February. Elaine was there. The hospital staff was there. The physio team is there twice a week. I have everything I need." He left without responding. I stood at the window and watched their car back out of the visitor parking and drive away, and I felt something I hadn't expected to feel. Not satisfaction, not vindication. Something more like grief. And also, underneath the grief, a kind of solid ground, like I'd stopped standing on ice and finally found something that held. The weeks after were not easy. He called 3 times. The first call was anger dressed as concern. The second was his wife, very measured, very reasonable, suggesting family counseling and a fresh conversation. The third was him again, quieter, saying he didn't understand where this had come from and could we please just talk. I listened to each of them. I said the same things in different ways. The boundary held. Elaine came for coffee on Wednesdays, same as always. My physio said my left-hand grip was back to 80% and would keep improving. The Nursing Scholarship Fund sent me a letter acknowledging my pledge and naming it the Terrence and Joyce Memorial Award, which made me cry in a way that felt clean rather than sad. In May, something I hadn't expected happened. My son's sister-in-law, his wife's sister, the one who'd let slip about the beach photos, called me. She said she'd heard some of what had happened. She said she thought I should know that Callum had been asking about me. Said he'd been upset that the last visit to Thunder Bay had been at Thanksgiving and kept asking when he could see Grandma again. She asked if she could bring him up for a weekend. Just him. She had a cousin in Thunder Bay she visited anyway. I said yes before she finished the sentence. He arrived on a Saturday morning in June with a backpack and a Tupperware of cookies he'd helped his aunt make in the car. He walked into the apartment and looked around and said, "It smells like your house always smells." I didn't ask what that meant, but I hoped it meant something good. We spent the weekend doing things that don't sound like much from the outside. We walked along the waterfront, we went to the science museum, and he spent 45 minutes in the geology exhibit because he is, apparently, extremely interested in rocks right now. We made pancakes on Sunday morning, and I let him put in too much vanilla because that's a grandmother's prerogative. At one point, he climbed up onto the kitchen stool and watched me pour batter and said, "Grandma, I was really scared when you were sick." I said, "I know, sweetheart. I was a little scared too." He said, "I made you a card, but Mom forgot to give it to you." I said, "That's okay. You can make me another one." He went and got his backpack and produced a folded piece of construction paper, slightly crumpled. On the front, he'd drawn a figure in a hospital bed and another figure standing next to it holding a red balloon. Inside, he'd written, in careful printing, "I love you, Grandma. I hope you feel better. From Callum." And then, below his name, in smaller letters, "I miss you." I put it on the fridge next to a photo of Terrence. He asked if he could come back for Thanksgiving. I said there was nowhere I'd rather have him. His aunt, who'd waited in the lobby while we said goodbye, gave me a long look when she came to collect him. I think she understood more than she let on. I didn't ask, and she didn't explain. Some things don't need to be named to be real. It's been 4 months since the confrontation in my living room. My son and I have not spoken since the 3rd call in April. I won't say that doesn't hurt, because it does. I raised him. I have 38 years of memories that are real and good, and mine, and they don't disappear because of what he did. But I also can't unknow what I know. The calls to Roberta and Patricia. The 31 unanswered calls from the hospital. The vacation photos posted while I was in a ward bed. The retirement community conversation 3 weeks later. Love doesn't erase a pattern. It just makes it hurt more. What I can tell you is this. I sleep better now. I have coffee with Elaine every Wednesday. Callum is coming for Thanksgiving, and he's already asked if we can go back to the geology exhibit. Roberta invited me to join the church rummage committee, which sounds terrible on paper and has turned out to be the best 2 hours of my week. My physiotherapist cleared me for longer walks, and I've been taking them along the waterfront in the evenings when the light over Lake Superior does something remarkable that I have no better word for than holy. I've booked a trip to Halifax for September. I've always wanted to see the Maritimes. Terrence and I talked about it for years and never got there. I'm going alone, which is still a strange thought, but a good kind of strange. The kind that means something has changed. People ask me sometimes whether I think my son will come around, whether I think things will heal. I don't have an answer to that. I hope so, because despite everything, he's still my child, and Callum and Ren are still my grandchildren, and family is worth fighting for when the fighting is honest. But hoping for reconciliation is different from making yourself available for whatever comes next without condition or boundary. I spent 31 years in healthcare learning that the kindest thing you can do for someone is tell them the truth about their condition. No softening, no false comfort, just here is what's happening, here are your options, here is what care requires. I applied that finally to myself. I am 64 years old. I had a stroke in my kitchen on a Tuesday morning, and I called 911 and unlocked my door, and I survived. The only person in the room when I woke up was a woman who lives down the hall and makes good soup and never once let me feel alone. That's the whole story. That's also, I think, the one that matters. The thing about making oatmeal every Tuesday morning for 20 years is that it becomes invisible, ordinary, the kind of act that asks nothing of you and expects nothing back. And then one morning, it becomes the last thing you remember before your face goes numb and the spoon hits the floor. And suddenly the ordinary is the most important thing that ever happened to you. I've thought about that a lot since February, about how much of my life I spent in the invisible middle, the reliable one, the one who showed up, the one who asked nothing and accepted whatever was offered. 31 years of nursing taught me that the body keeps a record even when the mind refuses to. And I think the same is true of relationships. The record was there. I just hadn't let myself read it. What I understand now is that what happened between my son and me wasn't a single failure. It was the sum of 100 small choices he made over 3 years, and 100 small choices I made to explain them away. That's the honest part. The part I had to sit with, because it takes 2 people to build a pattern like that. He chose to pull away, yes, but I chose to keep reaching as though nothing had changed, to keep making myself smaller and more convenient, to keep deciding that his comfort mattered more than my clarity. When Roberta told me about the phone call he'd made in January, the questions about my memory, my competence, whether I was safe alone, I felt something shift. Not rage, the way I'd expected. Something quieter. A kind of recognition. Because a person who respects the one they're calling doesn't ask those questions. A person who genuinely loves their mother doesn't build a case against her while she's making oatmeal on a Tuesday morning. What he did required a particular kind of calculation, and that calculation told me everything I'd been refusing to hear. What carried me through wasn't bitterness. It was something more like clear-headedness, the same quality that made me unlock my front door before I sat down on the kitchen floor to wait for the paramedics. The ability to see what's actually in front of you, name it accurately, and act on what you know rather than what you wish were true. That's not a dramatic thing. It's just the discipline of being honest with yourself, even when the honest answer is painful. And then there's what Elaine showed me. She didn't do anything grand. She made soup. She sat in a chair for 4 nights. She carried 2 cups of coffee down a hall. But she did it without being asked and without keeping score, and in doing so, she reminded me what it looks like when someone simply decides that you matter. That's not a small thing. That's the whole thing, really. I think about Callum showing up with that crumpled card in his backpack. I made this when you were sick. The instinct in a 9-year-old to reach toward the person he loves, that instinct is still intact in him. And I intend to do everything I can to make sure it stays that way. Because that's what this whole year has been about, underneath everything else. Not the will, not the confrontation, not the legal documents. The question of what gets passed on. I don't want to pass on the habit of making yourself invisible. I don't want to pass on the pattern of accepting less than you deserve and calling it love. What I want to pass on to Callum, what I want him to carry into his adult life, is the understanding that showing up for people is a choice you make on the ordinary Tuesday mornings, not just the dramatic ones, and that a person who knows their own worth doesn't need to negotiate for basic decency. The plane ticket to Halifax is sitting on my kitchen counter. I look at it every morning when I make my oatmeal. It's just paper, but it means something. It means I'm still here. Still going, still choosing. That's enough. That's more than enough.